Hey, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to our May Accessibility Talk. And if you've joined us before, we gather every month virtually and talk about all things accessibility, generally focusing on website accessibility. Each month, we invite a speaker to present on an accessibility topic. And afterward, we invite the community to ask questions and participate in some discussion. I'd like to welcome you all to, and let me pause that. I want to remind folks, though, that Ally Talks seeks to provide a friendly and safe environment. We encourage people to engage in productive dialogue. So that enables us to share and learn with each other in an atmosphere of respect. We require everyone, participants and speakers and hosts, to adhere to the Drupal Code of Conduct. And this applies to all of our community interactions and events and on Twitter as well. Verbal questions, chat, all of that. If you have a question for our speaker during the presentation, please post it in the YouTube chat window, or you can tag it in Twitter with the hashtag A11yTalks. That's Ally Talks. I am Amy June Heinlein. I am the open source community ambassador for Canopy Studios and on their web accessibility team. Our speaker is a frequent flyer with us. It's Mike Gifford. He is the founder and CEO of Open Concept Consulting. Our presentation is really about how Mike wanted to do some basic modeling for accessibility and saw the need to simplify things. And he started a project called A11y Axioms on Twitter. He wanted to define some essential truths in order to get people to get a better sense of how to approach accessibility when it comes to today's digital landscape. So hopefully today he'll cover some of those approaches, and we'll conclude again with a Q&A at the end to see if we can't make them better. Okay, so for some questions before the talk, Mike, I follow you on Instagram and all the good spaces, and I would love to hear about where you went last for your photography trip. I know it's been a while since we're all sort of like in social distancing, but maybe not the last place you went, but what's the most exciting place you went recently to do some photography?
The last place that I went that was of interest was Palm Springs, but a year before that we went to Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka was amazing. It was really quite amazing to go up and to do that. It's interesting how much travel I did last year compared to this year. I mean, it was visiting people in California and in Washington State and Vancouver and in England, and we bounced around quite a lot last year. But this year it's pretty quiet. So it's mostly stuff around home. So mostly what I take pictures of these days is my dog or things that are unusual or funny and yeah, random stuff.
Right. And I'm a huge music fan. If you pay attention to the talks that I host, I always ask what the speaker has on their current playlist. It's always interesting what people are listening to.
I have a whole range of sort of electronic sort of music from Daft Punk to tabla music to, I've got a mix that I've sort of pulled down and I'm using to just to have some music in the background to go up and make sure that I stay awake as I'm working away.
Right. It's hard to stay awake sometimes. So let's take it away. Mike, why don't you tell us some basic truths about digital accessibility and the A11y Axioms project?
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go off and share my screen. Hopefully this all works. And let's see. So can everyone see that all right? Hopefully.
Yep, we gotcha.
Excellent. So thanks for inviting me back. It's really nice to go off and to see the Ally Talk movement continue and to see the range of speakers that you brought together for this. For people who have trouble seeing the slides, they're all pretty simple. So each of the slides that I'm going to be using contains a short idea and either a blue background sort of that's holding the space between them, or a photo I've taken of a sheep. I do like sheep. But I've taken the idea of like the slides should be there to hold your attention, but they're not necessarily there to, I want to try and make sure that they don't distract from what I'm trying to say. So they're just there to go off and to keep people focused on the slide and the idea that I have outlined. So I have a number of basic things that have, or axioms I've tried to hold down, and I have about 40 slides. There's more axioms that I've created in my GitHub page, and some of these we're going to go off and I've skipped through, and some of them are ones we may need to discuss in the questions. But they're basic truths that we can hold about accessibility. What do we know to be true? What can we build on, or what can we get agreement on, so that we can have a common language around this? So accessibility is a complex problem. How do we define those basic truths? So as Amy June said, I reached out on Twitter. I created a list and include some basic concepts that are part of that. I also wanted to go and because it's on GitHub, I'm allowing people to add issues or to fork the code and provide pull requests. But ultimately, I want to go off and make this list better and more concrete, so that we can have, there's more agreement around this. If you tweet about the session, please use the A11yTalks tag, and also A11y Axioms, the other one. So now to jump into the talk. Standards. So the WCAG is a good start. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines it's only there as the beginning. The larger goal, and trying to move towards that larger goal of an inclusive society. Achieving WCAG 2.0 AA conformance is good, but it is insufficient on its own. We want to go off and make sure that people understand that just because you meet the compliance, that you are not necessarily accessible. That is just a starting point for that. I also want to make sure that people realize that WCAG isn't perfect. It's only as good as the people in the community behind it. Creating community is hard, but a necessary precondition of building a common solution. I've had many talks with people who've engaged with trying to create standards within the Web Accessibility Initiative of the WC3. And it is really hard work to try and bring people together, to build consensus, to understand what are those conditions that you can hold up as a standard, and so it's something that is going to improve over time, but something that still it takes work to get it better. It gets easier. A site with some accessibility enhancements will be easier to comply with newer accessibility guidelines. A site that meets WCAG 2.0 single A should be easier to remediate to meet WCAG 2.1 AA than a comparable site that hasn't had any accessibility considerations given to it. New accessibility guidelines are built on the previous ones. A site meeting WCAG 2.1 AA will also meet WCAG 2.0 AA. Design. Design with people with disabilities. User-centered design isn't going to give you the results, as good a result as user-led design. Design with and not for people with disabilities. So, and as early as you can bring them into the process to make sure that you understand the challenges that they're dealing with, the better your results are going to be. Avoid brittle digital solutions. Without an inclusion lens, digital solutions are brittle. Permanent disabilities hit about 15% of the population. Temporary and situational disabilities affect us all. Thinking about accessibility early helps reduce the higher cost of remediating older implementations. It is interesting to go off and think about how difficult it is to remediate for accessibility after a tool has been built. And if we can build it into our cultures and our budgeting and our design, our thinking processes to push accessibility as early as possible, that certainly helps. Design for the extremes of humanity. If you start with the starburst of humanity, it'll be easier to meet WCAG later. Products and services that are built for the 80-20 rule, or the Pareto principle, are harder to make inclusive afterwards. Keep it simple. Start with sound document structure. On that, on the web, that means semantic HTML and adding WI ARIA if the semantics can't be added through HTML. The CSS to solve, use CSS to solve visual layout issues and JavaScript to enhance behavior. The whole idea of progressive design and making sure that you're able to have failover in case somebody doesn't use JavaScript. You're not building in the assumption that you have JavaScript enabled and that you're working with one set of one set of tools. Uncomplicated interfaces are easier to make accessible, more usable, and will be simpler to maintain. Software. Don't overlook authoring tools. Public-facing authoring tools get more review than internal-facing sites and authoring tools. Not all disabilities are publicly known, and the abilities of our teams change over time. It's ridiculous how few sites go and look at the accessibility of the authoring interface. We find that there are lots of content management systems out there that have not done anything to try and ensure that people with disabilities can be authors or administrators of the content. And we're really fortunate that the Drupal community is rallied around trying to make the back end of Drupal as accessible as possible. And we've done that since Drupal 7. And it's been a really great way to go after to bring more people in and to make sure that we're not excluding people from participating in the conversation. So the authoring tool is a really strong piece of the accessibility challenge, and we're also overlooking the ATAG Part A of the authoring tool accessibility guidelines is the part that is addressing the user interface, trying to make sure that people can use the authoring tools. Part B is actually about trying to go up and make it as easy as possible for people to go up and to build on the interface. Critical mass matters. The more people who use the same system, the more likely it is that your organization will be able to benefit from somebody else's work. Communities that share and encourage openness are best for finding solutions. I wanted to go off and put this in there just because it's important to remember that if you build a custom solution for your particular organization, you're responsible for maintaining all of the problems and all of the issues that come up with it. If you're using a popular open source or proprietary tool, then at least you've got the benefit of other organizations who can push for improvements in accessibility to take on the features of that. So if you're looking at adopting a tool set that is more uncommon, think about the potential cost of not having that critical mass behind you. Overlays don't work. I had to make this really plain and simple. There's no way that overlays can fix all accessibility issues. You can't add meaningful semantics and document structure after the fact. These JavaScript overlays can fix some issues for some disabilities, but WCAG requirements are broader than this. Often you actually need to bake that accessibility, and you need to go off and provide the author the ability to go off and to define semantically what it is that they're trying to express, and make sure that the author is able to do that in order so that the reader can understand it. So trying to go off and be aware of the limitations of what these tools do. And often when people apply overlays, it's something that actually hurts the community because people assume, oh, we've got this widget, that means we've taken care of accessibility and nothing else needs to change. And unfortunately, it's not the case. There's no overlay that will bring you to a WCAG 2.0 AA compliant site, let alone a site that is meeting the needs of your users. Software development. Build with tested patterns. Start building with patterns that have been previously tested for accessibility. This will reduce the cost for implementing WCAG. We so often are starting from yeah, if we start from something that is being evaluated and being tested, it probably won't have caught all of the accessibility issues that are within it, but you will have caught the basic ones. Again, if you're starting from scratch, if you're building your own patterns, then you're going to have to make sure that it works not just for a limited set of tools that you have access to, but for the wide range of devices and configurations that people are using to go off and to navigate and to use your system. So look for tools that are being tested for accessibility. Open makes things better. Make things open. It makes things better. That's actually a quote from the UK GDS Government Digital Services design standard. It's especially important to go off and make things open with digital accessibility, because this is where everyone is trying to keep up with the internet. The internet moves very quickly, and you've got standards changing, you've got browsers changing, you have assistive technology changing. If you're working on your own, or if you're working in a closed issue queue, it's very difficult to go off and to define that issue. If whatever the product is that you're using, if it has an open issue queue, it's much more likely that you'll be able to find that error on Google and share both the bug or the way that you've used to remediate that problem, and to learn from others as well. So, working in the open is really good for accessibility. Shift left. The earlier you start incorporating digital accessibility into your digital tools, the less expensive it will be, and it will be to become accessible tomorrow. I have another summary of this as well. It's not actually part of the axioms just yet, but it's the best time to start addressing the accessibility issues is when you are building your product and service. The second best time is now. So, hopefully you've already thought of this and you're already going off and incorporating these design processes. But if you don't, this is a good time to go off and it's as good a time as any to go off and start working on it, to identify the issues and to start pushing the product ahead as best as you can. No area is better than bad area. So often WIA ARIA is used improperly. ARIA is an important enhancement to HTML5, but it must be applied very carefully. It is more difficult to assess ARIA semantics than it is HTML5. Sites with lots of ARIA will take more time to check to see that if it's accessible. We've seen many places where developers try to go off and use ARIA in order to go off and to patch a problem and to fix some accessibility issue. But it's difficult, and if you don't have somebody who really understands ARIA, the chance of them getting it correct are pretty small. So stick with HTML where you can, apply ARIA where you need to, but to focus on those solutions that you're able to go off and that you're confident about, or patterns that are tested by other people. Don't assume that you know how ARIA works simply by reading the ARIA spec. Software as a process. The internet is an ecosystem, and all of the software on it is part of that living system. We need to move from leveraging periodic checklists to building an ongoing journey. All CMSs are broken into elements which the editor can control, and all of these are managed by a system which developers build. This is how it is. In many cases, a content management system is similar to how a photo sits within a frame. There's pieces of it that make a nice whole, but you need to have understand the differences between the content that you are creating and the frame that your content management system is also exposing to your users. And we have to remember again that this technology is changing all the time. Drupal works with a web server, whether it's Apache or Nginx or IIS, and that sits on all works with PHP and works on servers and with front end frameworks, and and they all fit together and hopefully work to produce a beautiful experience. Fixing legacy tools is expensive. It is much more expensive to make a legacy tool accessible than it is to rebuild on a more accessible platform. Older software is likely to have more accessibility problems. Although this is not universally true, accessibility awareness and tools are improving, and older tools are likely to have more accessibility problems in them. So again, we can't assume that the new tools have been built with some of the accessibility tools that are available now, whether that's ACTS integration into a continuous integration cycle, or whether it's the Wave toolbar or site improve or whatnot. We can't assume that the older tools, older sites haven't been reviewed, but it's less likely that they will have been evaluated by some of these newer accessibility tools. So constant vigilance is required. Just because an interface did meet WCAG 2.0 AA requirements doesn't mean that it will 6 months later. Technology, the W3C standards, and they're constantly changing. Even just the use of technology. I mean, 10 years ago, most people would still be struggling to go off and imagine using a web application to go off and to do their banking, their documents, there's so many things now that we do through the web, and there might also be a desktop application for that, but we assume that if we're using QuickBooks, we may be able to use the desktop app or the web app in order to go off and exchange, in order to function. So our assumptions are changing drastically, and so we need to go off and make sure that we're keeping up with what society is expecting and how society is expecting to use technology. And some of the older standards and older patterns just simply don't keep up with people's current expectations. Accessibility testing. Manual testing is required. Automated testing is a great first step, but you can only find about 1/3 of the issues through accessible automated testing. A blended approach will provide the best results. Plan for tests that can be automated along with your continuous integration cycle. Find tests that can be applied by your themers and your designers, and automated tools that can help support your editors and others who are working on your site. This is really a team effort, and there are a whole range of different accessibility tools that can be incorporated to help make it easier for your authors to make the right choice. But you need to be thinking about that, and also reminding everyone that just because it passes the automated tool, it doesn't mean that you've made your site accessible. No accessibility tool is perfect, nor is any one tool going to always provide the best results. A combination of automated tools should be used. Some of the errors identified may be accessible false positives. The automated tests are getting better over time. The more tools are adopting to the W3C's accessibility conformance tests, or the ACT rules. And those that do will provide greater consistency in the results from different tools. But there still isn't going to be one tool that will be able to go off and satisfy the needs of all users in all contexts. Everyone can do keyboard testing. Well, so keyboard issues hold about 40% of accessibility issues, and most of the automated tools do not evaluate for them. Testing for this is relatively easy, but it is often overlooked. Just taking the time to tab through an interface, making sure that you're able to go off and evaluate the use of your site without a mouse. It's something that sounds really quite trivial, but something that is overlooked by lots of people, and something that whether that's keyboard traps or the loss of focus, or just not being able to get access to certain elements of the user interface, not following a logical order. Those are other things that are problematic. And there's ways to address this, but yeah, everyone can do keyboard only testing, and if it doesn't make sense to you as a keyboard without using your mouse, it won't make sense to your users either. Involve people with disabilities in the process. Involving people with lived experience in disability early in the development process will produce more accessible results. We often have assumptions about how people with disabilities interact with technology, and it's if we can bring people with disabilities into the design process and engage them, we are going to be able to have a better result. We simply can't rely on using automated tools to go off and to evaluate whether or not something is accessible or not. Authoring. Make it easy for authors. Authoring experiences can shape the accessibility of their work. The authoring tool Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 Part B is a strong example of this. I'm often shocked how people don't, especially larger organizations, don't invest in ATAG, because it's hard. Training your authors is expensive, and trying to go off and to fix problems once they've already been published that your authors have created is also really quite annoying. So if we just built our user interfaces so that it was easier for our authors to do the right thing, it would be something that would be much easier for everyone to work with. So, how do we try and make sure that more content management systems and other authoring tools are thinking about what they can do to support the authoring experience and make sure that it's easier to create accessible content by default, and that we're not asking authors to do some extra steps to sort of jump through the hoops and in order to meet the compliance of the compliance requirements. I think it would save a huge amount of money if it was just if people invested in fixing these tools and building these tools so that the tools were supporting authors rather than dealing with the problems afterwards. Accessible by default. If accessibility is the easiest default option, more things will be accessible. Let's make sure to focus on shifting the defaults. So I'm going to mention here the photo here. Most of the photos have been of pictures I've taken, but this is Dolly, the genetically cloned sheep, and my wife took the picture. And the Dolly is not actually alive here. This is a stuffed version of Dolly in a museum, but she looks quite lifelike in that particular photo. But yeah, how do we make sure that people are picking the right defaults and that we're building these in so that it's as easy as possible to do the right thing? And this goes for developers and for people who are creating themes, that we're trying to go, if we build in the best practices, then it'll make it easier for everyone else to go off and to follow them. I was looking at some Jekyll pages that for a project that we're working on just earlier today, and there were a couple issues that I posted on it on the theme for the site a few 2 months ago, and again, I don't know how many people have downloaded that theme and used that theme in the last 2 months, but Jekyll and GitHub pages are really quite popular these days, and if we don't fix these themes and fix accessibility changes in them, then they're going to propagate out to other websites, and so they're going to be bad patterns are going to be produced, and it's going to take somebody else to identify and find those patterns before they fix them. It'll have to be done site by site, rather than trying to make sure that we're doing this across the board when we're building and releasing the source code. Achievable goals. Digital tools will never be completely accessible, just like it will never be completely secure. We have to get our heads around the fact that your website will not be 100% accessible. There are always more things that can be done to make your site more inclusive. And it will depend on your users and your budget, how inclusive you want it to be. Be focused on making sure that your site is more accessible today than it was yesterday. We just need to build in the journey and try and make sure that we're moving ahead and moving with a community of people who are involved in the website, whether it's the content management system we use, or our design team, or the editors of the site, trying to make sure that we're identifying the tools and the problems and making sure that we get better with it over time. Digital ecosystems aren't standard. The digital ecosystem is based on standards, but it is not standardized. Despite the call to design with web standards, browsers and assistive technology are all working to build a competitive advantage. New standards are often slow to incorporate into the user agents, and bigger companies often include extra elements that better support their users. So we can't assume that in terms of the challenge of an author conveying information to a user, there's a whole bunch of layers of technology that need to be jumped through to make sure that somebody is able to communicate an idea to a person with a disability, and just sort of making sure that all of those tumblers are lined up so that the message can be conveyed effectively it's a challenge. But remembering that some of these tumblers do not line up particularly well, and the more work we do to go off and to think about that whole journey of information, how do we try and envision that whole stack of technologies? It's something we need to do more to make sure that we're thinking about the systems that we're using. People and processes. It takes a community. Good accessibility is a community effort. In order to effectively address accessibility issues, we need experience outside of our project teams. Collaborative approaches will achieve the best results in the long run. Individuals can only do so much in isolation. The more people champion and apply a lens around accessibility and inclusion within an organization, the more they can scale their efforts, capacity, and improve outcomes for people who use their products and services. So let's try and find ways to go up and build a community around the tools that we use. Feedback loops keep it real. There will always be users who find barriers to the use of technology. Having an open feedback system will help to identify new accessibility issues. This might be based on configuration, it might be based on use cases. We need that feedback loop, and that needs to be built into the system. We're not building a system, marking it WCAG 2.0 AA compliant, and then leaving it for the rest of time. We need a way to go off and to keep looping back in and making improvements. There is no average user. We're going to need to deal with personalization. It's inevitable. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, and digital tools, they're not, a single digital tool is not going to meet everyone's need. Dark mode is just beginning. There's more work that's being done on animation because of visually induced motion sickness. We need to think about what are the how do we design systems that encompass the diversity at the edges, and make sure that we're looking to go off and respond to change, and that this is something that if we're thinking early about the fringes, this will cost less in the long run. Accommodation and accessibility gatekeeping are expensive, brittle, and degrade quickly. This is much bigger than a checklist. There's no checklist that you can follow that will make sure that your digital tools are inclusive. Checklists are useful reminders, but too often in accessibility, they become limiting in how people approach a complex problem. We need to find ways to go off and to keep checklists. I think they can be useful guideposts, particularly if they challenge us to do new things, or if they change in a way that goes off and responds to bringing people along and making sure that people are learning new things with accessibility and testing out new things to see if there's something that they may have overlooked in the past time that they've looked at the web page. But we're not going to be able to create a single checklist that people are going to be able to walk through and address a challenge with. The other thing is that checklists are often done in a way that's very mechanical and very dehumanizing. And so again, I'm not opposed to checklists, but they have to be done in a humane way. We are not machines. And so if there's a way to go off and to use these checklists to go off and to support support people and doing things that only people can do, then that's terrific. But let's not be using people as meatware to try and navigate through information that can actually be addressed and resolved through use of automated tools. So it's more complicated. Most designers and developers underestimate the complexity of digital accessibility. Many teams assume that they already know how to make pages accessible. And sadly, this is often not the case. Digital accessibility requires an ongoing commitment to education. There's always new material being created to help practitioners learn how to be more inclusive. Web accessibility involves technology, but it should not be technocratic. Empathy is required to make good judgments, and ultimately this is ultimately a human issue. Objectivity is needed to guide judgment, and thus we need to invest in common standards. So that is the end of my slides. I hope you enjoyed my sheep and enjoyed the opportunity to go off and to hear some of the ideas that have been aggregated through these axioms. Hopefully, we've got some questions from the crowd where people are disagreeing or agreeing with me, and we can walk through some of those. Amy June?
Yeah, we did have some questions in the YouTube chat. Hi, Amilda. It's nice to see you in there. And she had a couple of questions, which I found really interesting. One thing she mentioned, like you said, with the visually induced motion sickness, the VIMS. Yep. She acknowledged that some folks have issues with the spinning and the movements. And what should providers whose services include 2D or 3D design, how should they handle accessibility issues? Like what kind of testing can they do?
I mean, partly it's making sure that you can turn it off. And this is something that the iPhone recognized as a problem because, again, the iPhone was making their users sick. And they found an easy way to just disable that in the configuration. They added that in after the release of which version of iOS it was that included that. But making sure that you have some way to disable it. There's also media preferences that are built into most browsers now. So you can go off and ask your designers to go off and to do media queries, to go off and look for user preferences. So if a user has determined that they would like to go off and minimize the animations, then you should provide an alternate image for the people who would like to have reduced motion. I guess the last thing, I mean, it's always useful to have a widget on your page that allows you to go off and to turn these things off and on, and to think about how long is your accessibility, or how long is your animation there for, and how large is it on the page? Because that's a big part of what affects this. Is if you have a large parallax site that has a lot of things moving in and out through it, it affects a huge portion of your user's visual field. And the smaller those changes are, the more they're accents instead of large design elements, the less impact it will have on your users. But there still is no way to go off and to test for, or to say this is the way that we ensure that you're safe for animations. And it's especially difficult because you don't know what size somebody's zoomed their screen up to. So if you've got somebody who's using their screen at 200 times the normal size, I mean, that's well within the WCAG requirements, but it means that your animation is twice as large as the designers originally anticipated it to be. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Right. There was some discussion with Imelda and Glenn in the chat about how often sites should be tested to ensure accessibility. Glenn mentioned that it depended on how big the site was, how many changes were being made, that kind of thing. And that testing is never really done. You had mentioned that. I found this to be true, especially when there's always content being entered, because, you know, all the code in the world doesn't do any good if the people have content that breaks the site's accessibility, right? So do you have any sort of like guidelines for how often a site should be examined?
Well, I mean, if it's an actively developed site, then there should be continuous integration built into that, so that that testing is happening every day before anything is committed, any change is committed to the site. So that should be something that is happening always. There was I mean, in terms of frameworks, there's the Web Experience Toolkit, which was built by the Government of Canada. And for a long while, they went and tested that framework every 6 months to see that it met the requirements that they that they had built into it, just to keep up with the browsers and keep up with the assistive technology. They wanted to test it every 6 months. And that's probably more than what most organizations can or frameworks can handle. Maybe not, but certainly I don't think it's unreasonable for large systems to be able to go up and to think about doing testing on an annual basis. But if you're looking at individual websites, there's definitely an advantage to having site-wide accessibility monitoring to evaluate your site. And again, that's something that happens on an ongoing basis. And having those accessibility statements built in to bring in that feedback back and have those accessibility loops, so that if you do miss something, you'll know about it for your users before. I mean, hopefully you find about it beforehand, but you have that openness to bring in information from your users.
Right, exactly. There's something that you mentioned that really kind of hits home for me about authoring tools, and how sometimes that sort of slips through developers and designers' hands, because like as a person who uses the back end of Drupal a lot, you know, I appreciate Drupal because we do so much accessibility testing for the back end for people who are designing the platform. But when I move into other content management systems, the interface is so less accessible. So that really resonates with me, how sometimes the people using the tools are sort of an afterthought.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that. But I want to go back to testing. How does someone who's new get started? What are like some of the top tools people should start with when they're new to testing? Because you had mentioned a few in your talk.
I just want to briefly say on authoring tools that there's a group that I'm advising that's organized by Funka, it's the We for Authors cluster, and I'm trying to go off and work with or to represent the Drupal community in this group of content management systems that are commonly used in the European Union, and trying to get better best practices built into the authoring frameworks. And it's really quite exciting to go off and to think about bringing different authoring tools together and say, well, what can we learn from each other? And what are the things that we can share? So there's interesting discussions with people from Clone and from, we don't have anyone from WordPress, but we've got, I'm blanking on the other ones right now, but it's neat to go off and to think about ways of I think we may have, it's interesting to see the opportunities of sharing best practices with other sort of communities of code. As far as simple tools though, I think that the Wave toolbar really still stands out there as one of the best, and it's like for somebody who doesn't know what they're looking at, if you see those big red buttons, then it's like, oh, okay, I understand that's a problem, and it's easier for people to install than pretty much anything else. I mean, there are other great tools out there, but I find that Wave just does a nice job of simplifying it and visually representing it in a way that is meaningful for people. I do really like the Microsoft's Accessibility Insights tool as well. There's a lot of nice things that they've built into that, particularly the ability to go off and track the keyboard focus. So that's a really nice interface. And they have a larger list of tests that you should do beyond just the fast pass for it. But it's more complicated than the Wave toolbar, which is just, it's so simple and so concise that it's hard to beat. That and keyboard only testing, like again, if you everyone should be able to go off and to navigate a website without a mouse. I mean, most people probably haven't done this, but it's a really simple way to go up and to understand the frustration that real users are having with websites, because there are sometimes it's like, where am I? Like, and the frustration of just trying to navigate through a website and figure out what am I clicking on and where will this go? Which, as a user who generally uses a mouse, it's I don't experience it that much of the time unless I am testing to see how accessible a site is. But
And that's so true. Recently, I've given up using my mouse because the trackball is dirty and I haven't cleaned it. And then my laptop is up high, so the trackpad's here.
right.
And I've just been using my keyboard. And it's interesting when people say, oh, there's these accessible platforms like Zoom or something. And I'm like, no, I can't get to the start button unless I, go up on the top. So the keyboard testing really is, I think, key. And to kind of tie from that, if you've been at accessibility testing for a while, but you aren't, 100% into it, how do you go about getting up to date? Are there any sort of like, I know checklists are a good idea, but how do you keep up to date with all the different things that are going on? Is there a centralized recommended place to do that?
Well, I've got a great newsletter, which I'll tell you about. But but in fact, it's more Canadian focused than I think this general audience is. So I'm happy to share the link to that. But there are other ones that have been around longer and are doing probably a more useful role of just trying to go off and provide ongoing information about what's available, whether it's the ALI Weekly one that David Kennedy organizes, or David Baines in the UK has a great one as well. Laura Carlson has one. There's so many great ones out there that just come in your inbox on a regular basis, and just something to go off and to be reminded about all of the things that are happening. And I've decided with mine to just put one a month, and it's amazing how long it gets just going off and taking things that are like interesting subjects. It's like, oh, this is a neat little fascinating area that I hadn't thought of, and here's some people who are working on this particular issue, and how this is applied to the mobile devices, or how it applies to this particular set of users, and or how it applies to COVID. And like, there's so much out there that is going on in the space, and people are sharing. I think there's more momentum, I think, now than there ever has been. So get on a mailing list, or start one of your own, and find ways to go off and get your community to go off and to pay attention to this issue, and share what you think is valuable to you, what you've come across with others. Stuart Hayes from Entopia went off and did an interesting talk at CSUN, I think it's 2 years ago now, where he was talking about the ability to go off and to build accessibility culture within an organization. And that simply starting with an accessibility, like a newsletter, that you're gathering information from other newsletters and sharing that out has a huge potential to go off and to raise awareness with your colleagues, and to make sure that you're sharing information and trying to build a community practice around something that you're not necessarily an expert in, but that you're advocating for and interested in learning more around.
Cool. I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier, the group that you were with working in Europe. What was the name of that group? I didn't catch that.
It's the Funka We Are Our Authors. Sorry, We for Authors. If you search for We and the number 4 authors, again,
okay.
I'll provide the link for that as well. But
okay.
It's the first opportunity I know where people are looking at the authoring tools and sort of trying to, other than the ATAG standard, which Yuta Travarius and others at the IDRC spearheaded, I think that this Funka project is really an interesting one to try and gather information together, and to build build some patterns that are out there to help improve the authoring experience.
Cool. Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but we were sort of wondering, what do you feel is coming next with accessibility?
It's an interesting question. There's one of the challenges is that so much of this is being driven um, by legislation and by in the United States, lawsuits have driven so much of this. I do think that in general, personalization is going to be more and more important. I think that's something that we're expecting in many ways in our lives, and trying to go off and build, even for something as simple as dark mode. There's lots of ways that dark mode has not really been fully fleshed out as a pattern that sort of so that you have that the everything from setting your user preferences in your device, to setting it in your browser, to setting it on your website. All of those are slightly different, and you may choose to turn it on and off in the website, and overrule your browser or your device's main settings. And again, we need to think about the complexity of this when we're addressing other issues, because that is going to be a big thing. But yeah, COVID has thrown everything sort of into question, and I think that I'm hoping that with COVID there will be a greater appreciation of the need for accessible digital transformation. We have so many tools that have not been built for accessibility, that now people are trying to use in their day-to-day life as they're commuting, or they're telecommuting into work, and we need to go off and since there aren't now alternate ways, you can't just sort of ask John or Betty if they could print out this document or share this information with you. It's much harder to go off and convey this information in multiple means. So we have to go off and pay much more attention to digital accessibility when we're creating these new digital tools. And so far, there's been a lot of rallying cries around that, but I haven't seen a lot of movement around this, except for the GAD pledge that Joe Devon and Jennison and others are setting up, and it's nice to see that Facebook is trying to go off and to put real energy into making React more accessible by default. Hopefully we'll catch up with Gatsby fairly soon, and they'll be build some of the best practices that Marcy Sutton and others in the Gatsby team have built into that. But we need to see more organizations and more frameworks, more platforms taking accessibility seriously, and making sure that it's not just about the front-facing side, but also looking at the authoring tools and making sure that people who have disabilities now or at some point in the future are able to go off and access their tools.
And that is so true, because I organize a lot of events, and we're doing a lot of platform investigation and asking the platforms, like, what can we do for this and that, and they have the privacy and the security issues, and now they have the accessibility issues, and they seem to give that as much thought now that a lot of us aren't using their tools because of certain reasons. And
right.
It's so true.
We need people to step up and say, and ask about accessibility, and make that vocal in public, and do that on Twitter, and do that in other places. Make sure that it's part of the conversation, so that when you're looking at buying a service from a vendor, that they hear that accessibility matters, and that's part of the decision that's going to be affecting your choice. They need to hear that.
So we're getting to the top of the hour.
Yeah.
So thank you again for presenting, Mike, and I'm sure we'll see you again soon. And I want to remind folks that the links will all be available later on YouTube when it's posted online. And come back next month and see what we have to say about accessibility. So thank you very much, Mike.